Well, it looks like everybody's here. On group 1053, Charles Fulton is presenting. If you're in the wrong room, good time to sort of find the right room. A couple of little things to get started before we get started to talk about. If you have phones, please silence them. Everybody should know that. There are these surveys, there are hard copy surveys, and there are some online. Should you want to fill them out afterwards. There will be time for questions and answers after Charles is done. So, just raise your hand and ask your questions. If you can speak up so it will be recorded, so it'll be heard on the recording. If not, I may blurt out the question again so we're sure it's recorded and heard. Charles will be introducing himself more thoroughly as he begins. And I think that is kind of about all we have to cover as we begin. So,
all right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right, John.
All right. Good morning. Thank you all for coming. My talk today is entitled "Don't Push Rocks Uphill: Deploying WordPress with Capistrano and Composer." These slides are available online if you'd like to follow along. Jump ahead of me, whatever. My name is Charles Fulton. I'm a web developer at Lafayette College. Originally a Moodle developer by training since about 2008, and moved over to WordPress administration in addition in 2013, which was kind of a surprise, but it's been a pleasant one. Lafayette is a small liberal arts college in Easton, Pennsylvania. That's in the Lehigh Valley, right on the border with New Jersey on the Delaware River. I can see New Jersey from my office. We have an enrollment of 2,400. Strong commitment to open source, and an engineering program, which is odd for a college of our size. We do it to compete with Lehigh. We're small enough that there's just one central IT organization. There's no satellite IT or anything like that. I'm part of the web development team. We come under IT. There are 3 of us. So we own platforms for, say, the branded website. We own the platform, but we work very closely with our colleagues in communications who actually own the content, and that's a partnership, and it works very well. Web development owns many things. This is a not entirely exhaustive list of the different platforms that we self-host and manage, and that's 3 of us working together, well, 2 developers and a manager. And as you can see, it's quite varied. And yes, we really do own the college's entire MySQL database infrastructure, which is a Galera cluster and some replica nodes. So we're generalists by inclination because our responsibilities are so varied. All right, with preliminaries, WordPress. Started with single WordPress MU installations back before proper multi-site in 2009. Faculty, staff, student blogging. This is before I was at Lafayette, and apparently my predecessors liked what they saw, because when we moved from static flat file sites to our first CMS in 2010, we did it with WordPress 3.0, the first multi-site release. One thing led to another, and the WordPress footprint at Lafayette is now rather substantial. Now, obviously, we don't have 100 themes and plugins on any one site. They vary. Different sites have different loadouts, but there's a lot of bureaucracy and a lot of overhead. And what I'm going to be talking about is just how it is that we're managing the deployed state of each of these 12 separate installations without driving ourselves completely insane. So to give you a sense of where we're going to go over the next 25, 30 minutes or so, we have a solution in which we're using Composer to manage the actual version history, version state of each of our themes and plugins, and then we're using Capistrano to actually deploy the tool. What we like about this solution is that WordPress Composer and Capistrano are not really designed to work with each other, but each is very good at the one thing that it does. And we brought the 3 tools together and have a fairly solid solution. So our considerations with deployment, I'm going to talk a little bit about what Lafayette's environment is. Some of these are very specific to Lafayette and may not apply at your institution. We hardened the document routes on our web servers with SE Linux. Apache cannot write to its own document route. That's great for security, but it does mean that no upgrade button, no installing things from the interface. It's just right out. We don't do that. So we need a solution that gets us there a different way. But, as I saw from the previous slide, web development owns everything, including our own servers. We have root, we have shell, we do not have to go through intermediaries to actually deploy things. So that gives us some freedom in how we architect a solution. We have discrete development, staging, and production environments. They're in separate networks from each other. They can't talk to each other. Well, everything can talk to production because it's in the public, but we need to be able to have something where we can go to development, we can go to stage, we can go to production, and have the same outcome each time. And as I said, we're generalists. We have 4 Moodle environments. Whatever we built for WordPress, we wanted to be able to take the work we did and with some minor retooling, adapt it to Moodle, adapt it to the various custom PHP projects we support. As we ruled out a solution that was too specific to WordPress. Git's really important in all of this. This is not a Git talk. I'm not really talking about Git today. That's a totally different subject. I have a slide at the end of this presentation with a list to a whole bunch of really awesome Git talks. And I'd like to thank WPCampus Slack for helping me compile that list. But I'm not going to get into the weeds on Git. So in the beginning, or 2013, WordPress was in a pretty bad place at Lafayette to the point that we were starting to think about moving to Drupal just because of the management problems that we were having with WordPress. That obviously didn't happen. But we were just moving zip files around manually on our remote servers when we needed to do an upgrade. Upgrading, at the time we had 10 multi-sites, upgrading them for the next major WordPress release was a 6 to 7 hour process spaced over 2 maintenance windows, 1 per week. And that's not accounting for overhead. That's just the actual time spent moving things around and getting things where we wanted and doing the browser-based upgrade. We had no version control in place. We didn't know what particular versions of themes or plugins we had. As I said, confidence level, shaky at best. We had and continue to have an entirely normal directory structure. This will become important later. Core WordPress, themes and plugins in the usual place, uploads directory. About half our multi-sites are of the right vintage to have at least Blogster in addition to uploads, or sometimes only Blogster, because keeps changing. Which, from a version control perspective, is slightly obnoxious because you have things like themes and plugins with their own version history, but they've got to be installed inside the path of WordPress, which has its own history, and that made our heads explode a little bit. And we needed to find a way to work around that we didn't hate. So we started with the idea that you should treat each WordPress installation as its own software project. So why not? Projects have dependencies. WordPress has dependencies. I mean, this is what's going to go into any particular WordPress installation. And those dependencies are going to come from a fairly wide variety of places. Most themes and plugins from WordPress.org, but then there may be things that are only out on somebody's GitHub, or maybe in your own private GitHub or self-hosted GitLab or wherever, or maybe there's something like Gravity Forms, which you're just buying off a website and downloading manually and then probably shoving into your own private GitHub. Things can come from a lot of different places, and in the default state, you have a WordPress installation that looks something like this, which is not great. It's not the best. I'm not quite sure what core WordPress is in this metaphor. I think it's potentially, I think it's this. But we don't want that. And that's where we were in 2013. What we're looking to get to is something more like this, where everything's nicely lined up. We know what's in each box. We know where it's going, and we can move things around with confidence. This is where we're going to try to get to. So we're managing the project. We're not managing the code, and this is the key difference. We have a Git repository that's the project, that's the particular, each individual multi-site installation. But we're just going to track component versions. We're not going to actually commit code because we don't want to commingle the history of, say, a theme with a plugin or the theme and the plugin with core WordPress. And we, as an organization, we want change and change management to be purposeful. And we don't want it to be too easy to modify a plugin or core WordPress in order to suit some particular use case that came up. As if we're going to core hack, as it were, we want there to be a little bit of overhead. Like, okay, we did this, we made a new version, we tagged the new version, and we are keeping track in our internal documentation. We did this thing. We don't want to get to a point where we can't state exactly what version we have deployed in any one place. So I want to start with a cautionary tale and make fun of myself a little bit. Talk about our first stab at solving this, which is not the ultimate solution. We went with a Git submodule-based approach. This was, yeah, I'm gonna give you a minute. I'm not here to bury submodules, but I am here to state that you probably shouldn't do what we did. But so a Git submodule is just, you can in a Git repository, you can say part of you're going to have this other project that's at this particular path. So you can see here, for example, those of you following along online, I'm pointing at the screen. You have a submodule, say multisite plugin manager. It's a plugin, it should be installed at this path, and it should be installed from this repository. And that's a way to incorporate a project with its own history into your project, in this case, a core WordPress installation. And instead of actually versioning the code, then you're just keeping track of the repository that was added, where it should be installed, and at what hash, at what place it is checked out. And so you wind up then with a fairly reasonable looking repository structure. You have a get modules file, you have core WordPress, and you have, it still mimics the directory structure of themes and plugins. The problem is you are, of course, polluting the history of core WordPress in order to do this. The other problem, of course, is this presupposes that every single theme and plugin and other dependency you are adding to WordPress is available in Git. For your private projects, for the premium things you download off the internet, this is true. For themes and plugins off WordPress.org, of course, these are not managed in Git. You can download them as a zip file, or of course, there's the subversion repository that's used for publishing and making things available on WordPress.org. Now, I've made my piece of that as a deployment model, as a plugin developer, but it does mean that you're going to have to do a little bit of extra work. And so what we did was we set up a process to convert each subversion repository that we needed into a Git repository. This was I am here to say that I now regard this as a mistake. So it's a mistake because of the overhead. The WordPress theme and plugin subversion repositories, I mean, ultimately there's just 2 of them, but you only work for a particular path at a time. They're massive. There are tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of revisions. Importing a theme or a plugin from one of them in the initial import took about 3 to 4 hours each. And that's assuming you didn't fail or have because of a non-standard structure, particularly older WordPress themes, just any one random person setting up how to structure a repository. We had all kinds of problems getting certain older themes to import. And then, of course, having imported it, you create a private Git repository, you push everything in, and you hope that the tags that you got were somehow reasonable. We did this for 2 years, and it was just a horrible, horrible slog. For actually deploying, then you have this project repository of all the submodules, so it's cloned out on the server. You initialize the submodules, do a whole bunch of fetches and other magic, and you have some shell scripts to help you do this and make sure you don't get things wrong. And I never liked that because, of course, you're not going to ship the shell scripts in the repository because that might mean a shell script exposed to the public, which, I don't know, seems bad. But it meant that there were things about deploying the project that were external to the project repository, and that had its own set of challenges because it meant you might forget to do things. So yes, lots of overhead. It was fast. It was absolutely fast. and we had a fairly high confidence level that these particular versions were checked out. So that was good. This saved WordPress at Lafayette because we got our house in order. But it was obviously not quite what we wanted. So when we started to retool in 2015, we were looking for a way to kind of bring the dependency management to the projects and come up with things that were maybe a little lighter weight. So to keep the metaphor going about pushing rocks uphill, if the rocks could just stay there and not have to be pushed uphill during a deployment, that's obviously better. I mean, unless you enjoy pushing rocks uphill. Show of hands, does anybody do that for exercise, recreation? No one? No, good. So yeah, we needed a solution where we were overlaying the dependency management. We are working with the projects, with the dependencies, not against them, and maybe not making too much work for ourselves because heaven knows everybody else is doing that for us. So what we want to be able to get to is a situation where, this is just a JSON file, kind of a mocked up JSON file, where we can just define our repository, define what it is going into a WordPress installation, and then that's it, without the additional overhead. So in this very simple example, we're saying, we want to kismet at what amounts to a reasonable version and core WordPress. How do we get here? How does this actually become actionable? So Composer is a package manager, and in our defense, it wasn't really mature in 2013 when we started building this solution. So Composer, in this example, this is a composer.json file. It contains metadata for a project. So you can see here, there's a name of a project, description of it, and then all these dependencies where you have these key pairs defining a particular project's name and the version constraint. And this is semantic versioning. A full discussion of what semantic versioning is beyond the scope of this talk. But just saying, there's just ways of expressing confidence and saying, well, maybe I need things at this version, maybe it doesn't matter, maybe whatever version's available. And each of these names is just a reference to a package in a Composer repository. In this case, the central Composer repository, which is called Packages. And in this case, a project that's registered on Packages, someone has simply said, this is the name of my project, and this is a source control repository where this project can be found. And so then Composer can ask Packages, hey, do you know about this project in this version? It says, sure thing, boss, you can go download it from here. And so that way you're piggybacking on somebody else's version control, but you don't have to re-implement it for yourself. Now, of course, this helps you not at all with WordPress because WordPress projects are not registered in Packages. Well, I'm sure a couple are, but in general, they are not. And for your own private projects, say, private base themes, private plugins, you're not going to want to put them in a public repository. It might not even be possible, let alone wise. So you need a way to make those available to a Composer manifest. Well, simplest way to do it is Composer will let you call just about anything a Composer repository so long as there's a composer.json file in it defining what the project is. So you could just tell it, here, look at my private GitHub, go look here, and here's the code. And that works until you have, say, 20 private projects, which winds up being a massive amount of overhead, especially if any of them change. Let's say, for example, actually this is not a hypothetical, you have 6 different multi-site installations at your college, all using the base theme, and the base theme's internal name needs to change. You might have to go through and change that in each project, make sure you do it right. It's introducing a source for error, and it's unwieldy. There's a project called Satus, which lets you take all of the, essentially you take all those definitions, put them into a composer.json file, and then it gives you a nice little interface, web server, so that you have a Composer repository that serves up all of your private projects. So you put all that nasty stuff in Satus, and this is actually, should have extracted that. This is a real example. These are all pointers to Lafayette's internal GitLab instance. And then all that has to go into the project is simply a reference to wherever your Satus project is hosted. And this is very flexible. In addition to your own private projects, if somebody is managing something on GitHub that has a composer.json file, you could throw that in there. That way you're not having to remember, oh, where's this person's GitHub repository? No, you just put it here. And then if it changes, you can change it in one place. And obviously, again, elephant in the room, this does not help at all with the themes and plugins on WordPress.org. They don't have composer.json files. And yeah, you don't want to be in a situation where you're maybe trying to, copy them over again and add them. Fortunately, this is also a solved problem, and not by me. Outlandish built a composer mirror for the WordPress.org themes and plugins database called WordPress Packages, or WPCampus. It queries these with a web service and builds essentially a list of, again, all the name and version pairs. So that this requirement, WPackage plugin Akismet, and this version has meaning. It gives you that zip file. And so at a stroke, all WordPress.org themes and plugins, so long as the plugin author has adopted a rational tagging scheme, and thus far, in my experience, all but one has, you can use that to get the versions of these particular packages. So it's a solved problem without jumping through a whole bunch of hoops. So there again, you have a project repository, you have a pointer to WPackages, you have a pointer to your own private installation if you need it. And now it's actually possible to define all the WordPress theme and plugin dependencies that your project has in Composer with these version constraints without actually having to manage any code in your project repository. You're just managing the state. I left WordPress Core to the end. It's possible to manage WordPress Core with Composer. We chose not to, mostly because there are some interesting situations that happen of trying to do a full site install with Composer. It's a bit arcane. I have a link to a blog post at the end of this slide in which I discuss exactly what the challenges were. But we opted to keep WordPress in a submodule using the official GitHub clone of WordPress. If you go down this path, you'll soon become very aware that when WordPress releases, this lags behind by about 30 to 45 minutes. But so our project so far with core WordPress and all our themes and plugins is simply a composer.json file and the submodule with core WordPress, and that's it, which is very easy to manage. So how do we actually, this sounds great, fine, thanks. How do you actually get this on a web server and do something with it? Tool for this is Capistrano. It is a Ruby application because, of course, we are going to be deploying a PHP app with Ruby. This might be considered an off-label use. I like to think of Capistrano as telling a kind of a deployment or developer story, because in it you put all the information that's necessary for deploying an application. So as you can see, our project has suddenly gained a whole bunch of extra files. Things like the cap file and the gem file are just kind of helpers that I'm not going to go into today. But in deploy.rb, it's just a file in which you tell Capistrano various things like what's the name of your project, what Git repository is it located in, what path should this project deploy to on a remote server, what tasks should it run, should it install Composer modules, should it initialize a Git submodule, should it do various NPM tasks, are there shell commands that you should run. All these things get encapsulated in this file. And then within deploy, you define environments. So you can say, and my staging environment is on these servers, and you should do these additional things when deploying to stage, and you should use this Git branch by default when you're deploying to stage. just to prevent yourself from accidentally doing something that you shouldn't have done. Another thing we like about Capistrano as implementation is when you do a deployment, there's no, so I deploy off my laptop. And I didn't need to do any additional configuration on my laptop to do this beyond cloning the repository and setting it up, but there's no laptop specific configuration, there's no server-side configuration. I'm able to deploy this project because logged into my laptop as me with my SSH keys, I have the proper access to the web servers, and I also have the proper access to our remote Git repositories, which Capistrano will be downloading from as it installs the various Composer themes and plugins. So if we onboard a new developer, we can tell him or her, get the repository, and that's everything you need to know. We wouldn't do that because that's cruel, but we could. So actually on the remote, in a Capistrano deployment, that's getting back to something I was talking about initially with the challenges with having themes and plugins inside core WordPress. An issue that we had with submodule-based approach is when you're doing that, you have things like your uploads directory sitting inside to kind of untrack things in a Git repository, and it's kind of messy. And you also run the risk if you're doing things with that repository of accidentally blowing away your uploads, which would be bad, I think. So nice thing about Capistrano is it does a lot with symlinks. So you define things like your htaccess file, WP-config uploads, you put them in this directory that's outside of your deployment route, and every time you do a deployment, Capistrano symlinks them into the correct place. So your WP-config is where it's supposed to be, so to speak, but the file actually lives outside the document route. Yeah, like I said, it loves symlinks. So you do a deployment, and all of a sudden there are symlinks all over the place. The real deployment magic is happening in releases, because every time you do a Capistrano deployment, you get a time-stamped, it's might call it time-stamped checkout, where it puts all of, it'll put WordPress, your themes, your plugins, everything goes into this one timestamp directory. And then when it's done, it creates a current symlink that points at that, where it had previously pointed at the last known good release. Means it's very easy to roll back if you realize you did something stupid. You say roll back, and it just takes that symlink and points it back at the previous release, and then flags that release you just did as bad, so it won't try to go back to it again. That was a capability we just really didn't have with submodules. I mean, we could, yeah, if you were to roll back submodule release, you'd start checking out different hashes in some of the submodules, and it would get very bad and inconsistent. Not that we've actually had to roll back. So with tasks, it's a pluggable infrastructure. Obviously, Capistrano does not support Composer out of the box, but there's some helpful person on the internet who maintains a module that does just that. Again, with submodule support, NPM, there are any number. These are just the ones that we generally have to use, because again, WordPress architecturally is really not that complicated to deploy. This is what a typical environment file might look like. And this is a case where Capistrano let us fall into a capability we didn't even know we wanted in 2015, which is the ability to do a high availability deployment, which is almost live at this point. Because as you define multiple servers, Capistrano will execute the deployment tasks in parallel, with the final symlinking occurring simultaneously on the remotes. So we're never in a situation where there's one version of WordPress deployed on server A and one version of WordPress deployed on server B. That was a problem that we realized with Capistrano was solved the minute we started talking about high availability. We never had to think about it. Similarly, it lets you define roles. You can these words could be anything, but app and web for one, just web for another, which is a helpful way for us to say to Capistrano, you've got a task for running the WPCLI database upgrade command. Please only do it on one server, not both. That said, I don't know what would happen if you tried to do that. I don't know if there's proper locking or not. It might work. As I said, at some level, this is deployment and documentation. everything you would need to know about deploying this site, in theory, is located in these various configuration files. So we don't have any external tools that live somewhere else that are necessary to manage this process. I mean, we do have additional documentation. I wouldn't actually just throw this repository to a new developer and say, hey, please go redeploy the production website tomorrow. But ultimately, everything that's necessary to do that is located in that repository. So now I'm just going to quickly step through what certain tasks look like in this environment. So PowerPress. PowerPress has new releases all the time. Any other PowerPress users? Good Lord, what do you use for podcasts? But in this case, we can just do a composer update on that name, and it goes out, goes to WordPress.org, finds that, yep, we've gone from 703 to 704, downloads, we update the log file, push, deploy, and it's done. And that's all we had to do. This process takes approximately 30 seconds. And that's also depending on the version constraint. We could set a version constraint that's just like 7.0.*, so we're just getting the incremental releases. So again, this depends on the person having a responsible tagging scheme. And we've certainly been bitten by that before. That's the command to redeploy production. I thought about doing it before I found out I wasn't presenting off my own laptop, but live demos seem bad, and live demos with production, you're just asking for it. But that's the command to deploy production. It takes about 3 minutes. We're trying to find a way to get the submodule piece to run faster. It's the bottleneck, but that's it. Database upgrades, same idea. We can just define a shell task to be run on the remote. We use WPCLI to do a database upgrade, and then I can just run it from my laptop whenever I so choose. And I'm never actually having to go onto the server, get on, worry about paths, remember the exact incantation for the command, because it's not necessarily something I do very often. And realistically, I'm doing this, 3 times a year for each multi-site installation, and probably at about the same time. This is particularly handy. We had a problem. We have a base theme with some fairly complicated CSS and JavaScript, and when it was handed off to us from the shop that developed it, the minify JavaScript and CSS were versioned in Git, which is not completely unreasonable, but it's obnoxious because you have merge collisions all the time, and you can't tell what changed because you can't diff a minified file. And we identified that as something we wanted to fix, and what we realized eventually that we could do is just define a grunt task that does all the minification stuff, because we had that already. We just moved it into its own file and told Capistrano, yeah, every time you redeploy this site, please step through that, and just please minify and release each time, because you'll forget one time and break production because production will have no theme. We did this about 6 months ago. It's been completely rock solid and sped everything up. So, having gone through that, the deployment is about as fast as it was with the submodule-based approach, which makes sense. It's a lot of the same kind of activity, but the overhead went from very high to essentially none, just so long as there's nothing weird about the theme or plugin. And our confidence level went way up because it's so easy to deploy. It's the same, it's basically the same command: deploy to dev, deploy to stage, deploy to production. You're going to get the same result each time. And where we used to only do kind of big catastrophic deployments, maybe every month and a half, we'll deploy during the weekday, we'll deploy during business hours, we'll deploy whenever it is we actually need to because something is ready to go out, whether it be a theme update, a plugin update. Just about the only exception is we still save the big WordPress core updates for a maintenance window out of an overabundance of caution. And also just for the stress on the database. So again, our whole approach here is that we are managing versions and state. We're not actually managing code in a project repository. The project repository is just keeping track of what we have and where it is. With, I like to think of minimum of bureaucracy. You can't eliminate bureaucracy, but you can eliminate unnecessary bureaucracy. And key was we got deployments fast, we got the overhead low, and we raised our confidence level, which was ultimately the goal. So, a few resources. I wrote these 3 blog posts. They're publicly available. Mostly just recapitulating in text form a lot of the things I said today, but also going to certain examples, some details, and also an extended discussion of why we're not deploying core WordPress with Composer. These are a bunch of great talks on Git and development, mostly coming out of the WordPress community, but some just more general. As I said, this is not a Git talk, but if you're unfamiliar with Git, you will need to do that before dealing with some of the other things that I've outlined today. That's the link for, I believe that's the correct link for leaving feedback. This presentation, as I said, is publicly available. Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate having such a large group of people coming to hear me speak today. And at this time, I'd be happy to take any questions that you might have. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry, yes. So the question was how big our team is. The web development team at Lafayette under IT is 3 people, 2 developers, and a manager who also does some development tasks. Our communications department has a digital division, has a digital communications team of 3 who do design work, IA, and content. And then, of course, we work very closely with our systems administration team, but they're not directly involved in the web stuff. So yes, that's a good point. We needed something that could be done by both myself and the other developer, and they couldn't be too involved because there's just not very many of us, and we have a lot of responsibilities. Thank you. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
Yeah, it's interesting to see a different method of using Composer because we don't use it right now. But I also wanted to know, like, when you started with this, WPCampus wasn't that mature. Is this something that you're thinking to maybe reuse it or compare this to, say, for example, using WPCampus to manage objects of WPCampus? Or do you still think that this is still helping your perspective?
Yeah, it's a good question. So question was, given the growing maturity of WP-CLI, would we consider using that to manage updates? I mean, the first answer would be I haven't looked at that part of WP-CLI functionality enough to know whether I would. I think the answer would still be no, because I like being able to look at a project repository and see what my version constraints are and just see what the deployed state is of my project, particularly over time. So, I mean, WP-CLI is coming a long way and doing fantastic things, and we use it obviously for a lot of administration tasks, but I don't think we would use it to manage updates. But you absolutely could, and that's absolutely a valid solution. Anyone else? Yes.
Not on Capistrano, but you said that you wrote code for WordPress and then ported it to Moodle. Can you elaborate on that?
Oh, yes. Thank you. So as I said, we needed a generalized solution. And you may have noticed that really none of this was really specific to WordPress, except kind of W packages. But even then, that's a general solution pointed at a particular thing. So we took this strategy and used it for our self-hosted Moodle environments. And again, same thing, using Composer to manage the dependencies, using Capistrano to deploy, and to get around the question of, I mean, Moodle plugins generally have their own Git repositories just because of how that community does its development. But again, no composer.json files. I worked at the collaborative liberal arts Moodle project to build a Composer mirror for the Moodle theme and plugins repository, very much like W packages, and that's something that Lafayette maintains. But yes, we were able to apply the same solution to our project with very little retooling, and for us that was a huge win. Thank you. I did not plant that question. Someone in the, yes, sir.
So the early part of your talk, you mentioned a number of dependencies, Composer, Satus, etc. So how do you, with
Yeah.
How do you manage
Yep.
those updates? And the second part of the question is, is there concern that you are now quite dependent on multiple projects?
So the question was, how do we manage updates to Composer and Satus themselves, and are we worried about our external dependencies? So yeah, Satus is an open source project. It's managed on GitHub. So from time to time, we download updates to that and redeploy the project. We manage that project with Capistrano and Composer, which is a little recursive. Composer itself, of course, is a PHP binary, and from this needs to be done a little better. We should be managing this with Puppet. We're not, but just from time to time, we update the binary on our remotes. And the internet's built on bailing wire. As we all learned from the various Amazon outages, there's an awful lot of stuff we've got that just does not work if somebody has a problem. It's a risk that we've accepted. I mean, realistically, you don't know what's going to break. I mean, if WordPress.org goes offline, we might wish that we did have all those old clones of the themes and plugins so that we still do a deployment. But we could also just wait for it to come back up. I mean, there's only so much risk mitigation you can do before you drive yourself insane. Certainly, if Composer or Capistrano were to cease to exist, we'd eventually be forced, just by the passage of time, to architect a new solution. I don't want to say one thing at a time because that's kind of flippant, but it just, if it happens, it happens. But they both seem like fairly stable, mature projects, and with a lot of people who are more important than us using them, so it's a risk we're willing to run. Anyone else? Yes?
I know you shared an article, so I will read it, but
Mhm.
I would be curious if you could give us a few words about why you decided to not manage Core with Composer.
Yeah. So the way to do that, and there's a lot of people doing this. I mean, I'm not talking about anything particularly new or revolutionary.
What was the question?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, the question was if I could go into detail why we're not installing WordPress Core with Composer. And a lot of people do. If you look at the WP Deploy or the Bedrock projects, this is a thing that they do. But they also do that by changing the way the WordPress document root is organized, moving things. We didn't want to do that because we were overlaying this on our existing deployments, and we didn't want to undertake the engineering to do that. And the reason they tend to move those things is if you install Composer, if you use Composer to install a full site like WordPress, because of the order of operations, it winds up destroying all the symlinks that Capistrano put in. So then you have no WP config file. We kept running into problems. And we said, nope, this is stupid. So we know what submodules are. This works. And that also meant that it was easier for us to occasionally hack WordPress Core, which we have done from time to time. So that's why. I mean, it's a combination of factors. And we do the same thing with Moodle for essentially the same reasons.
You're going to restart the whole process, start over, but would you still use Capistrano for deployment, or would you use something like build travel for CI?
Yeah, so the question was, if we were starting today, would we use a build system instead of Capistrano? Maybe. I should mention, we actually did come up with a way to automate this, but my boss, who's not here, won't let me do it because he's afraid of it. Okay, that's not quite true. But we have GitLab CI for continuous integration, and we had a container set up with Capistrano, so we could just push to it, and then it would redeploy on the remotes. So we had automation, but the lack of automated acceptance testing for WordPress led us to not pursue that, because without that, essentially without the ability to automatically detect a failed deployment, beyond things not deploying, like failed deployment as in, yeah, the code's there, but WordPress doesn't actually load. We decided to keep that part of it manual. I don't know, to be honest. Maybe? Yes?
So just a follow-up.
Mhm.
why wouldn't it work to automate through a CI to your dev server? You said you had dev, staging, and production servers. Check and make sure it works on dev before propagating it to staging.
So the question was, why not automate it and verify on dev? Part of the answer is specific to Lafayette's network topology. Dev's in a really weird place, and the CI server can't talk to it. And also, I would say that there's a certain institutional reluctance to have a process that works differently depending on network environment. That at some level, that is, we can say, well, it works this way with dev and stage, but then you do this thing with production. We've tried to avoid having a situation where that was the answer because it just goes to a long-standing concern about having inconsistencies between the environments. So I'd say that's why we could do that, absolutely, and I've thought about it. But at the moment, that's not something we're pursuing.
That's about all we're going to have time for.
All right.
30 seconds left.
Thanks, everybody. And please feel free to catch me in the hallway.